Imagine it's March 2009. You're a middle manager at a manufacturing company in Cleveland, Ohio. The financial system collapsed 6 months ago. Lehman Brothers is gone. Bear Stearns is gone. The Dow has dropped over 50% from its peak. Your 401k has been cut in half. Your neighbors are being laid off. The news talks about nothing but unemployment numbers and foreclosures. Your company announces a round of layoffs. 20% of the workforce. You survive the first cut. But there's a problem. You have $400 in your checking account, maybe $2,000 in savings. Your credit cards are carrying a balance from Christmas. Your mortgage payment is due in 3 weeks. Now imagine something different. Imagine you're sitting in the same chair in the same meeting, hearing the same announcement. But you have 8 months of living expenses in a high-yield savings account. Untouched, liquid, available. Same job, same company, same economy. But you're not the same person. One version of you spends the next 6 months terrified, taking whatever assignment is handed down, nodding along in meetings, never pushing back, never asking for a raise, never applying to that better job because you cannot afford a gap in income. You make decisions based on fear. The other version of you thinks strategically. You update your resume. You reach out to contacts. You consider that risky opportunity at a startup. You negotiate. You position yourself. You make decisions based on options. This is not about personality. This is not about confidence. This is about cash. And here's the thesis that most financial advice never states clearly. Cash is not primarily about emergencies. Cash is about power. The power to think clearly, the power to negotiate, the power to wait, the power to walk away, the power to act when others are paralyzed. This isn't theory. It's documented in behavioral economics and market data, in the historical record of every financial crisis. And once you understand how cash actually functions in a system, you will never look at your savings account the same way again. Let's start with what most people believe about cash. The standard financial advice says you need an emergency fund. 3 to 6 months of expenses. The purpose is to cover unexpected costs, a car repair, a medical bill, a job loss. This advice is technically correct, but it fundamentally misunderstands the real function of cash reserves. Emergency funds are framed as insurance, protection against bad luck, a buffer between you and disaster. But that framing misses the deeper mechanism. Cash does not just protect you when things go wrong. Cash changes how you operate when things are going right. It changes the decisions you make every single day. It changes how you negotiate, how you invest, how you respond to opportunity, how you think. This is the hidden function of liquidity that almost no one talks about. To understand why, you have to look at what happens to people who don't have it. The Federal Reserve conducts an annual survey called the Survey of Household Economics and Decision Making. The 2023 report found that 45% of American adults could not cover an unexpected $400 expense using cash or its equivalent. Read that again. Nearly half the country cannot absorb a $400 shock without borrowing money, selling something, or simply not paying. A $400 expense is not a catastrophe. It's a car repair, an emergency room copay, a broken appliance, a cracked phone screen. These are normal occurrences in normal life. When 45% of the population cannot absorb a normal expense, something structural is happening. The same data shows that only 55% of adults have enough savings to cover 3 months of expenses. 30% cannot cover 3 months at all. These numbers are not about laziness or poor planning. They reflect wage stagnation, housing costs, healthcare inflation, and a credit system designed to keep people in permanent debt service. But here's what the numbers don't show. They don't show the cognitive cost. They don't show the decision-making distortion. They don't show what happens inside the mind of someone who knows every single day that they are one small shock away from financial crisis. That's where the real damage happens. In 2013, researchers from Princeton and Harvard published a landmark study on the psychology of scarcity. They studied farmers in India before and after harvest, the same individuals, same intelligence, same capabilities. Before harvest, when cash was tight, these farmers performed significantly worse on cognitive tests. Their IQ scores dropped, their executive function declined, their ability to make long-term decisions deteriorated. After harvest, when they had cash in hand, their cognitive performance returned to normal. The researchers estimated that the mental burden of financial scarcity consumed the equivalent of 13 IQ points. That's roughly the cognitive impairment caused by losing a full night of sleep. Think about what that means. The same person with the same brain makes measurably worse decisions when they are short on cash. Not because they are less intelligent, not because they are less disciplined, because financial stress consumes cognitive bandwidth. The researchers called this tunneling. When you're financially stressed, your mind focuses obsessively on the immediate problem. The bill that's due, the payment you might miss, the repair you can't afford. Everything else gets pushed to the periphery. Long-term planning disappears. Strategic thinking disappears. You're operating in survival mode. And survival mode is expensive. This is where the mechanism becomes clear. People without cash reserves make different decisions, not because they want to, because their mental architecture forces them to. They stay in jobs they should leave, they accept salaries they should negotiate, they avoid confrontation with employers because they cannot afford unemployment, they skip medical appointments because they cannot afford the copay, they defer maintenance on their cars because they cannot afford the repair, they pay more for everything because they cannot pay up front. Each of these decisions has a cost, and the costs compound. This is not a moral failure. This is a system operating exactly as the incentive structures dictate. When you have no margin, you have no leverage. When you have no leverage, you cannot negotiate. When you cannot negotiate, you accept worse terms. When you accept worse terms, you have less margin. The loop is self-reinforcing. Economists call this the poverty premium. People without cash pay more for insurance because they cannot pay annually. They pay more for groceries because they cannot buy in bulk. They pay more for credit because they are higher risk. They pay more for housing because they cannot put down a deposit. They pay more for transportation because they cannot afford preventive maintenance. Being poor is expensive, and the expense keeps you poor. But here's the part that doesn't get discussed. The poverty premium is not just financial, it's cognitive, it's emotional, it's strategic. People without cash don't just pay more money. They pay with their attention, their energy, their capacity to think about anything beyond the immediate crisis. And that cost is invisible on any balance sheet. Now let's look at the other side. What happens when someone has 6 months of expenses in liquid reserves? The obvious answer is that they can handle emergencies. And yes, that's true. A job loss becomes a problem, not a catastrophe. A medical bill becomes an expense, not a crisis. A car repair is an inconvenience, not a spiral. But the obvious answer is the least important one. The real change is psychological, and the psychological change creates material outcomes. When you have 6 months of cash, you stop thinking about money constantly. The background anxiety quiets. You stop scanning for threats. You stop calculating whether you can afford lunch. You stop lying awake, wondering what happens if your transmission fails. That mental space does not disappear. It becomes available for other things. For the first time, you can think strategically about your career, about your relationships, about where you want to live and what kind of work you want to do. You can plan beyond the next paycheck. This is not a minor shift. This is a fundamental change in cognitive orientation. Psychologists call it moving from a scarcity mindset to an abundance mindset. But that framing makes it sound like a choice, like positive thinking. It's not. It's a material condition. You cannot think abundantly when you are materially scarce. The research is clear on this. The brain does not work that way. But when the material condition changes, when you have cash, the cognitive orientation follows automatically. This is why cash is power. Not metaphorically, literally. It changes the power dynamics in every negotiation, every employment relationship, every financial decision you make. Let's talk about employment. Consider 2 employees at the same company with the same skills, doing the same job. Employee A has no savings, lives paycheck to paycheck, has credit card debt accumulating interest. Employee B has 8 months of expenses in a savings account. Both of them are asked to work overtime without additional compensation. Both of them know they're being underpaid relative to market rates. Both of them have a manager who is unreasonable and creates a toxic environment. Employee A complains privately but complies publicly. They cannot afford to rock the boat. They cannot afford a gap in employment. They cannot afford to be seen as difficult. They accept the conditions because the alternative, unemployment, is unthinkable. Employee B has options. They can push back on unreasonable requests. They can have a direct conversation about compensation. They can begin a job search without desperation. They can walk away if necessary. Same skills, same job, same company. Completely different negotiating position. Over time, this difference compounds. Employee B gets raises that employee A doesn't ask for. Employee B switches to better opportunities that employee A can't risk pursuing. Employee B builds a career trajectory based on value. Employee A builds a career trajectory based on fear. After 10 years, the income gap between these 2 employees can be 6 figures. Not because of talent, not because of education, because of leverage. And leverage comes from cash. The same principle applies to every major financial transaction. Consider real estate. Studies show that cash buyers pay approximately 9 to 10% less for equivalent properties compared to buyers who need financing. Think about what that means in a housing market where the median home price exceeds $400,000. A 9% discount on a $400,000 home is $36,000. That's not a negotiating trick. That's the market recognizing the value of liquidity. Sellers accept less from cash buyers because cash eliminates risk. No financing contingency. No appraisal requirement, no loan denial, no closing delays. Cash transactions close faster, fail less often, and create fewer complications. The seller gets certainty. The buyer gets a discount. The mechanism is straightforward, but most buyers don't have cash, so they pay full price plus interest. They add 30 years of mortgage payments. They pay closing costs, insurance requirements, PMI if they're under 20% down. The person with cash gets the asset cheaper and owns it outright. The person without cash pays more and owes money for decades. Both transactions happened at the same time, in the same market, for the same asset. The only difference is liquidity. This pattern repeats across every market. Car purchases. A buyer with cash can walk away from a bad deal. A buyer who needs financing is locked into whatever terms the dealer arranges. The cash buyer negotiates from strength. The financing buyer negotiates from dependency. Rent negotiations. A tenant who can pay 6 months up front often gets reduced monthly rent or waived deposits. A tenant who can only pay month to month has no leverage. Landlord's price in the risk. Contractor work. A homeowner who can pay cash for a renovation often gets priority scheduling and discounted rates. A homeowner who needs payment plans gets slower service and higher quotes. Contractors, price in the risk. Debt settlement. A borrower who can offer a lump sum payment often settles debts for 40 to 60 cents on the dollar. A borrower who can only make payments gets no discount. The creditor prices in the uncertainty. In every case, the mechanism is the same. Cash eliminates risk. Risk has a price. Eliminating risk captures that price. The person with cash captures the discount. The person without cash pays the premium. This is not about wealth. This is about liquidity. A person with modest income but strong cash reserves captures these advantages. A person with high income but no cash reserves does not. Now, let's examine the opportunity cost argument. Some financial advisors argue that holding cash is inefficient. Money sitting in a savings account earns minimal returns. Money invested in the stock market earns average returns of 7 to 10% annually after inflation. Therefore, the argument goes, holding cash means sacrificing gains. This argument is technically true and strategically wrong. It confuses two different functions. Investment assets serve one function, growth over long time horizons. They are illiquid by design. You cannot sell stocks without transaction costs, tax implications, and timing risk. When you need the money is often when the market is down. Selling in a down market locks and losses. Cash reserves serve a different function, optionality over short time horizons. They are liquid by design. They are available immediately in any market condition without loss. These are not interchangeable functions. An emergency fund is not an investment. It's infrastructure. It's the foundation that allows everything else to work. Consider what happens when someone invests their emergency fund. March 2020. The market drops 34% in 5 weeks. Simultaneously, millions of people lose their jobs due to pandemic lockdowns. The person who invested their emergency fund now faces a choice: sell at a massive loss or go into debt. The person who kept cash can weather the storm and buy investments at a discount. The lost returns on the cash pale in comparison to the loss from forced selling or high interest debt. This is timing risk, and timing risk is real. The emergency happens when it happens. The market is priced where it's priced. You do not control either variable. The only thing you control is whether you have cash when you need it. But let's go deeper than emergency protection. Cash doesn't just defend against emergencies. Cash enables offense during opportunities. Markets crash. Real estate gets discounted. Businesses become available. Career opportunities emerge that require risk. Every one of these opportunities requires capital. The person with cash can act. The person without cash can only watch. Consider the 2008 to 2009 financial crisis again. During the crash, real estate prices dropped 40 to 50% in some markets. Stock prices dropped over 50% from peak to trough. The people who had cash bought assets at historic discounts. The people who didn't have cash were selling assets at historic losses, or losing their homes entirely. By 2020, those discounted assets had multiplied in value. The people who bought during the crisis captured generational wealth. The people who sold during the crisis locked in generational losses. Same economy, same markets, same opportunities. Different outcomes based entirely on liquidity. This is the offensive function of cash that nobody talks about. Cash is not just protection. Cash is dry powder. It allows you to act when everyone else is frozen. Now let's examine the historical pattern. In every financial crisis in modern history, the distribution of outcomes follows the same structure. Those with liquidity buy. Those without liquidity sell. Wealth transfers from the illiquid to the liquid. The Great Depression. Bank runs wiped out savings. Unemployment hit 25%. Those who had cash, in physical form, outside the banking system, bought farms, businesses, and real estate at pennies on the dollar. Those without cash lost everything. The 2008 financial crisis. Foreclosures spiked, unemployment doubled. Those with liquidity bought distressed properties and stocks at historic lows. Those without liquidity lost their homes. The 2020 pandemic, markets crashed, businesses shuttered. Those with cash reserves bought the dip and emerged wealthier than before. Those without cash reserves went into debt or bankruptcy. The pattern is consistent across decades, across countries, across economic systems. Liquidity determines which side of the transfer you're on. This isn't about predicting crises. Crises are unpredictable by definition. It's about positioning. You cannot know when the crisis will come. You can only know whether you'll be ready. Let's talk about the progression. Building cash reserves is not a single action. It's a staged process, and each stage creates a different psychological and strategic reality. Stage 1, basic stability. This is approximately $1,000 to $2,000 in accessible savings. At this level, you can absorb minor shocks, a car repair, a medical copay, an unexpected bill, without going into debt. This stage eliminates the most acute financial anxiety. You're no longer one small expense away from crisis. You can start thinking beyond the immediate week. Most financial advice stops here, but this is just the foundation. Stage 2, real protection. This is 3 months of living expenses. At this level, you can absorb a job loss, a serious medical issue, or a major repair without financial collapse. You have time to find a new job without desperation. You have time to recover from illness without panic. This stage creates breathing room. You're no longer operating in survival mode. You can start making decisions based on long-term value rather than short-term necessity. Stage 3, financial strength. This is 6 months of expenses or more. At this level, something fundamental shifts. You stop thinking defensively. You start thinking offensively. You can negotiate from strength because walking away is a real option. You can take calculated risks because failure isn't catastrophic. You can wait for the right opportunity because you're not desperate for any opportunity. This is the stage where cash becomes power. The psychological research supports this progression. Financial anxiety decreases in roughly this pattern. Cognitive capacity improves. Decision quality rises. Long-term planning becomes possible. Each stage builds on the last, and the benefits compound. Now let's address the implementation. Building cash reserves is not complicated, but it requires structural discipline. First, calculate your actual monthly expenses, not your income, your expenses. Fixed costs, rent, utilities, insurance, debt payments, plus variable costs, food, transportation, discretionary spending. Most people overestimate their income and underestimate their expenses. Be precise. Second, establish your target. 3 months of expenses is the minimum for real protection. 6 months is optimal for most people. If your income is variable or your industry is volatile, consider 9 to 12 months. Third, automate the process. Set up an automatic transfer on payday to a separate high-yield savings account. The amount matters less than the consistency. Even small amounts compound over time. Fourth, make the money accessible but inconvenient. A separate bank, a different login, no debit card attached. You want the friction to be high enough that you don't dip into it casually, but low enough that you can access it within 1 to 2 business days if needed. Fifth, choose the right vehicle. High-yield savings accounts currently offer 4 to 5% annual returns. This is not an investment return. It's a holding cost. The purpose is to minimize the opportunity cost while maintaining liquidity. The implementation is simple. The discipline is not. But the payoff is asymmetric. Let me be clear about what cash cannot do. Cash cannot make you wealthy by itself. Investment returns, business ownership, and career advancement create wealth. Cash creates the foundation that makes those things possible. Cash cannot protect against all risks. Hyperinflation, like Weimar Germany in the 1920s or Venezuela in the 2010s, destroys the value of cash holdings. Political instability can freeze bank accounts. System-wide collapses can invalidate currency altogether. Cash is powerful within a functioning system. It does not protect against system failure. But most risks people face are not system-level risks. They're individual risks: job loss, health crisis, divorce, unexpected expenses, market downturns. Against these risks, cash is extraordinarily effective. And for capturing opportunities within a functioning system, cash is essential. The goal is not to hoard cash forever. The goal is to have enough cash to operate strategically while deploying excess capital into growth assets. The proper structure looks like this: a liquid emergency fund of 3 to 6 months of expenses. This is never invested. This is never touched except for genuine emergencies. A secondary cash position for opportunities. This is for market downturns, real estate deals, business investments, career transitions. This is deployed when value becomes available. Everything above that goes into long-term growth assets, equities, real estate, business ownership, whatever fits your risk tolerance and time horizon. The emergency fund is infrastructure. The opportunity fund is ammunition. The growth assets are the engine. Without the infrastructure, the engine fails under stress. This brings us back to the central observation. 45% of Americans cannot cover a $400 expense without borrowing. Only 55% have 3 months of expenses saved. This means nearly half the country operates without the cognitive clarity that comes from financial security. Nearly half makes decisions from fear rather than strategy. Nearly half cannot negotiate, cannot wait, cannot walk away. And that 45% pays the poverty premium. They pay more for credit, more for housing, more for insurance, more for everything. They stay in jobs they should leave. They miss opportunities they should capture. They make decisions optimized for survival rather than growth. This is not a character flaw. This is a structural condition. But here's the uncomfortable truth. The structure is not going to change. Wages are not going to spike. Housing is not going to become affordable. Healthcare is not going to become cheap. The system is designed around consumer debt and the assumption of income vulnerability. You cannot change the system. You can only position yourself within it. And cash is how you position yourself. Let me leave you with this. Every financial decision you make occurs in one of two contexts. Either you have options or you don't. If you have cash, you have options. You can negotiate, you can wait, you can walk away. You can act on opportunity, you can think long term. If you don't have cash, you don't have options. You accept what's offered, you react instead of plan. You optimize for survival instead of growth. You make decisions under duress. The mathematics of this are simple. The person with options captures more value over time. The person without options captures less. Compound that difference over 10 years, 20 years, a career. The gap becomes enormous. This is why cash is not just protection. Cash is power. Not because money itself is power, but because liquidity creates optionality, and optionality determines what you can negotiate, what you can capture, and what you can refuse. The question is not whether you need an emergency fund. The question is whether you want to operate with leverage or without it, because the system will continue either way. The only variable is which side of the transfer you're on. This is historical and educational analysis, not financial or investment advice. This channel exists because most people never study the structure until they're trapped inside it. If understanding system before they affect you matters, consider subscribing.